Welcome to The Better Part. Cupertino TV Productions and the League of Women Voters of Cupertino-Sunnyvale have been working together for a long time now to bring you election information. We're thrilled to continue the partnership in 2016. I'm Susan Huff, Vice President for Voter Education of the League of Women Voters of Cupertino-Sunnyvale, and I'm here with League President Elaine Manley to bring you information about the upcoming election on November 8th. Now, because of the number of ballot measures in this election, we divided this show into two parts. The first one featured the criminal justice propositions, and in this segment we'll discuss the financial ones, including Propositions 51, 52, 53, 55, 56, 59, 61, 65, and 67. So let's start with the election calendar. Can you give us the basics?
Sure. To vote on Tuesday, November 8th, you must be registered by Monday, October 24th. The registration deadline is always 15 days before an election, and you'll need to re-register if you've moved or if you're no longer in prison or on parole for a felony. The easiest way to register to vote is go straight to registertovote.ca.gov and fill out the form online. It's very, very simple. If you haven't opted for permanent vote by mail status, you have until November 1st to request a vote by mail ballot. Your ballot must be postmarked by the election day, but the Registrar of Voters gets a start on processing the early ballots, so we appreciate you mailing it in early. You can also drop off your ballot at any polling place in your county on Election Day before 8 p.m., before the polls close. I'd also like to remind viewers that we are here as a service of the League of Women Voters. The men and women of the League take our educational responsibilities very seriously. The League does sometimes advocate for policies, although never for candidates. But when we come here from the League of Women Voters Education Fund, we are not here as advocates, unless we're advocates for thoughtful voting. We don't care whether you vote for or against these propositions. We just want you to understand what your options are so that you can choose what matters to you. We will let you know who is speaking out for and against the propositions, but since we tape this show very early in the election season, we're not going to know everyone who will support or oppose. So mostly we'll be telling you who assigned the arguments for and against a measure. Unfortunately, that doesn't tell the whole story, and the financial picture changes steadily throughout the election cycle. So at the end of this show, we'll give you some websites for updated financial information, as well as all sorts of education-related information. Now on to the election. What's new this time around?
We have 17 propositions on the state ballot. All of them need a simple majority to pass. In this segment, we're going to focus on those that affect the state budget, and we'll start with some of the bond measures. In order to finance long-term projects like buildings or roads, the state usually borrows money using general obligation bonds. General obligation bonds are repaid out of the general fund, and they tend to be among the least expensive forms of borrowing for the state. All general obligation bonds have to be approved by voters. Typically, the total cost of a bond measure adds up to about twice the borrowed amount by the time the state has repaid principal and interest over 30 years. Currently, the state has about $85 billion of infrastructure bonds that it's making payments on. That adds up to about $6 billion per year in debt payments. Your voter information guide has an excellent section on state bond debt that'll tell you more about how much the state has borrowed and the effect that any new bond sales will have. State school bonds provide funding that's made available to local districts when they have projects ready to move forward, and they're able to contribute local funding of about half the cost. If the district can't provide matching funds, it can apply for further state support in the form of grants. So Proposition 51 is a $9 billion bond measure that it will allow the state to sell $7 billion of bonds for modernization and new construction for the K-12 school system, as well as $2 billion to support the community college system. Currently, while the state is still paying about $2.7 billion annually in debt service for previously approved school and community college bonds, those bonds have all been sold. No funding's been available from the state for several years. Some local districts are able to move ahead with their capital projects using just local money. Others will defer projects if they can until the state funding is available to combine with their local funds. Now, if all of the Proposition 51 bonds are sold, we might expect an increase in the annual debt service payments of about $500 million. That'll vary with interest rates and with how quickly the bonds are sold. So who's taking a stand on this?
Well, in favor, we see the Community College League of California, the California State PTA, and the California Retired Teachers Association, with major funding coming from the Coalition for Adequate School Housing and California Building Industry Association. They say we haven't passed a statewide school bond in 10 years, and now we have a massive backlog of local projects. Without this bond, local taxpayers will face higher local property taxes. That creates inequalities between schools in different communities. So Prop 51 will help our schools and veterans succeed. Now, against, we see the California Taxpayers Action Network, and they say Californians already pay $2 billion each year on state school bonds and can't afford more, especially when school enrollment is projected to decline over the next 10 years. Large, wealthy districts would receive the lion's share because they have the staff to fill out the paperwork. Proposition 51 was created by the construction industry to benefit the construction industry. Now, you said there was another bond-related proposition on this ballot.
Yes. Proposition 53 isn't itself a bond measure, but it's about how we handle bond measures. We talked about general obligation bonds under Proposition 51. In contrast, Proposition 53 is about revenue bonds. Revenue bonds are paid back not out of the general fund, but using a revenue stream associated with the project. So as an example, bridge tolls might be used to repay the bonds sold to finance building the bridge. Currently, voters have to approve general obligation bonds, but not revenue bonds. Proposition 53 would change the law to require voter approval in order for the state to offer revenue bonds for sale if 3 conditions are met. 1, the state or certain associations that have the state as a member is the one selling the bonds. 2, the bonds are to support a project that's funded, owned, operated, or managed by the state. And 3, the revenue bonds total more than $2 billion adjusted for inflation. This is only going to cover a few projects. The only current projects that would be likely to be covered under this law would be the Delta Tunnels Water Project and high-speed rail. So who do we see talking about these propositions, and what do they have to say?
Well, the supporters include the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, with financial support from Dean and Joan Cartapazzi. They say this gives you a voice, a vote, and added transparency. Right now, there is no vote by the legislature or the people required to issue these massive state megabonds. Unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats have all of the power, and you have to pay. Now against are the California Professional Firefighters, the Association of California Water Agencies, and the California Office of Emergency Services, with support from the California Construction Industry Co-op Trust and the State Building Trades Council of California. Now they say this measure is financed entirely by one family who are spending millions in an attempt to disrupt a single water infrastructure project. It disrupts our ability to build critically needed water storage and supply. Cities and towns that work with the state to build needed infrastructure could have to put their local projects to a statewide ballot, eroding local control. So, moving off of bonds, let's talk about hospital fees.
Yes, that's Proposition 52. The Medi-Cal program provides health care benefits to more than 13 million low-income Californians. And last year, the program cost $95 billion. Private hospitals are required to pay a fee that helps cover the cost of Medi-Cal. This money is matched by the federal government, which gives the state additional funds to help pay for Medi-Cal health care services. The hospital fee is approved by state lawmakers. It's set to expire in 2018. If Proposition 52 passes, it would make the fee private hospitals pay toward Medi-Cal permanent. Because Proposition 52 is a constitutional amendment, it would make changing the hospital fee more difficult in the future. The fiscal effect of this measure is uncertain, and it would depend on what state lawmakers would otherwise do before the current fee expires in 2018. If they would decide to extend the current fee on private hospitals, there'd be little to no change to the state budget from 52. If they decided not to extend the fee, then the Proposition 52 funds from hospitals would save the state budget about $1 billion each year. Who's talking to us about this one?
Well, signing in favor of Prop 52 are the California Hospital Association, the California Medical Association, and the Congress of California Seniors, with funding coming from the California Health Foundation Trust, Foundation and Trust, and Dignity Health. They say yes on Prop 52 will keep a good idea working. It will help provide Medi-Cal health care services to over 11 million Californians, and it prohibits the legislature from using these funds for any other purpose without a vote of the people. Now, the opposing arguments were signed by individual healthcare workers, and the financial support is coming from a healthcare workers union. They say Proposition 52 gives hospital CEOs a check worth more than $3 billion with no strings attached and no oversight. It hurts the people who need it most and only helps hospital lobbyists and their overpaid CEOs. So what's up next?
Proposition 55. California's general fund is largely funded by the personal income tax, which provides about 2/3 of the revenue that flows to the general fund. Other important sources are the sales tax and corporate income tax. But because personal income varies with the health of the economy, California has historically suffered from volatility in tax revenues as a result of its reliance on the personal income tax. Remember, in November 2012, voters approved Proposition 30, which increased marginal income tax rates on high earners by 1% to 3% through 2018. Proposition 30 also increased the state sales tax rate by 1/4 cent through 2016. What Proposition 55 does is it extends the higher income tax rates of Proposition 30, although not that higher sales tax rate, until 2030. This is expected to bring in somewhere between $4 billion and $9 billion annually. The increased revenue would be allocated as follows: about half to schools and community colleges, which is required for any new revenue, but somewhere between $0 and $2 billion to increased Medi-Cal funding, and between $60 million and $1.5 billion to budget reserves and debt payments. What do people say about Proposition 55?
Well, in favor we find the California State PTA, the Children's Defense Fund, California, and Tom Torlakson. He's the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, with funding coming from the California Hospitals Committee and the California Teachers Association. They say Proposition 55 prevents up to $4 billion in cuts to schools and continues to restore funding that was cut during the recession. It requires strict accountability and transparency to ensure that the funds get to the classroom. And it doesn't raise anyone's taxes. Now, against, we hear from Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, the National Federation of Independent Business California, and the California Taxpayers Association. They say voters approved the Proposition 30 tax increases because they were promised they would be temporary. Now we have a budget surplus. We don't need higher taxes, just politicians with the backbone to cut waste and prioritize spending. Now, next up, 56 is an increase in the cigarette tax, right?
That's right. Currently, the price of a pack of cigarettes in California includes 87 cents in state excise tax and $1.01 in federal excise tax. Other tobacco products are taxed at a related rate. Currently, neither California nor the federal government levies excise taxes on e-cigarettes, electronic cigarettes. But if Proposition 56 passes, the state excise tax on cigarettes will increase by $2 a pack to $2.87. Other tobacco products will also increase. That's as a result of the law linking their tax rate to that on cigarettes. And for the first time, e-cigarettes will be subject to state excise tax. It's not certain how much revenue this will raise, because some people will smoke less, and some will evade the tax in buying their tobacco products. But it's estimated at something over $1 billion per year, decreasing as smoking rates drop. That money would be allocated first to older programs supported by excise taxes to make up for the revenue they lose when people smoke less, then among various state programs. But the bulk of the money would go to increasing the level of Medi-Cal payments, with smaller amounts allocated to tobacco prevention and control programs, enforcement, University of California tobacco-related disease program, physician training, the state dental program, and for administration and audits for the agencies receiving those funds. Proposition 56 does exempt the measure's revenue from the minimum education spending requirements of Proposition 98. What do we hear people saying about Proposition 56?
Sure, the Proposition 56 supporters include the American Cancer Society, California Division, and the American Lung Association in California, and the American Heart Association Western States affiliate, with the funding coming from California Hospitals Committee on Issues and the California State Council of Service Employees Issues Committee. They say Proposition 56 works like a user fee. It's taxing tobacco to help pay for tobacco-related healthcare costs. And it helps prevent youth smoking, and it fights e-cigarettes, Big Tobacco's latest scheme to target kids. Now, the arguments against were signed by a former director of the California State Board of Education, the Association of Orange County Deputy Sheriffs, and the National Tax Limitation Committee, with funding from Philip Morris and RJR Reynolds. They say Proposition 56 cheats schools out of at least $600 million a year. It fattens insurance company profits, and it spends over $147 million per year on overhead and bureaucracy. Now, our next one is about money, but not about the state budget. Let's talk about Proposition 59.
Proposition 59 is an advisory vote. There are two main forms of political campaign contributions: money given directly to candidates or parties, and independent expenditures. That's money given in support of or in opposition to a candidate, but without coordination with the candidate's campaign. Before 2010, federal law limited the independent expenditures that corporations and labor unions could make in federal elections. In 2010, however, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission that independent expenditures by corporations and labor unions are protected as free speech under the First Amendment. As a result, there's now no limitation or regulation on how much money can be given by these entities as independent expenditures. The ruling applies to federal, state, and local governments. The California legislature previously has asked that Congress propose an amendment to reverse the effects of Citizens United or call a constitutional convention for the same purpose. Proposition 59 asks voters whether California's elected officials should use their authority to propose and ratify an amendment or amendments to the U.S. Constitution that would reverse the effects of Citizens United and related court decisions, allowing government to impose more limits on political campaign contributions and spending, and make it clear the rights in the Constitution are for natural persons only. This is an advisory measure only, has no legal effect, and does not require any particular action by Congress or the California legislature. Who's supporting and opposing this one?
Yeah, the signers of supporting arguments include California Common Cause and Money Out, Voters In. And they say corporations and billionaires should not be allowed to continue to buy elections. Yet the Supreme Court gave corporations the right to spend unlimited amounts of money in our elections. So overturning Citizens United would open the way to meaningful campaign finance reform that will return ownership of our elections back to ordinary Americans. Now, the opposing arguments were signed by two members of the California legislature, and they say our ballots should not be clogged with pointless, non-binding measures. Do you really want this Congress to tinker with the First Amendment? Instead of working to amend the Constitution, we should work to require the disclosure of political contributions within 24 hours of receipt, year-round. Moving on, what else do we get to vote on?
Proposition 61 is on prescription drug costs. So the state of California spends approximately $3.8 billion on prescription drugs every year for people for whom the state provides health care or insurance. These drugs would be purchased for Medi-Cal patients, for state employees, for prisoners. Medi-Cal is the program that provides health benefits to low-income Californians. Medi-Cal and other state agencies negotiate with drug companies to try to make sure the state's getting a good deal. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA, buys prescription drugs for military veterans, and the National VA often gets a better deal on drugs than the state of California. If Proposition 61 passes, it will limit the amount the state could pay for prescription drugs. It would not change drug prices for insurers or private citizens. But state agencies would not be allowed to pay more than the Department of Veterans Affairs pays for a particular medication. Prop 61 would apply to most state agencies except the state's managed care system, but that covers 75% of the people on Medi-Cal. The state would also regularly check to make sure that their drug costs weren't higher than those paid by the VA. What do people say about 61?
In support, we see the California Nurses Association AARP California, and the California Democratic Party, with money coming from the AIDS Healthcare Foundation and the California Nurses Association. They say skyrocketing prescription prices are a matter of life and death, and Proposition 61 will end the price gouging. Proposition 61 empowers the state to negotiate the same or better deals for taxpayers as are paid by the VA. Now, in opposition, we have the Veterans for Foreign Wars of California, the Latino Diabetes Association, the California Association of Rural Health Clinics, and the California Medical Association have financial support from the pharmaceutical companies. And they say Proposition 61 only covers an arbitrary group of patients in certain government programs. More than 88% of Californians are excluded. Prop 61 would result in the elimination of the drug discounts that the state currently receives, increasing the state prescription costs instead of reducing them. Now, next up, we have a set of related propositions, 65 and 67. Why are we talking about the two of them at once here?
Mainly because they're both about plastic bags. Many communities ban single-use plastic bags, and in 2014, the California legislature passed a law that banned most single-use plastic bags and required merchants to charge at least 10 cents for other bags. The stores keep the money, and they could apply it to the cost of bags, to the costs of compliance, and to encouraging customers to use reusable bags. A referendum on this law qualified for this ballot, and that is what we see here as Proposition 67. Now remember that in a referendum, a yes vote confirms the law as is, while a no vote undoes what the legislature passed. So if the referendum passes, the law is upheld, and single-use plastic bags are banned throughout the state. If 67 fails, the state law does not take effect, although local plastic bags bans will remain. Proposition 65 redirects the revenue from any ban on free single-use bags from the merchants to a new state environmental fund. The fund would be used to support grants for programs related to drought mitigation, recycling, clean drinking water, parks, beach cleanup, litter removal, and habitat restoration. Because 65 and 67 are in conflict in some areas, what happens if they both pass does get a little bit complicated, so let's walk through it. If they both fail, the statewide single-use bag ban does not take effect. If 65 passes and 67 fails, the statewide single-use bag ban does not take effect, but any future statewide bag ban would see revenues from the sale of bags directed into 65's environmentally oriented fund. If 65 fails and 67 passes, the statewide bag ban takes effect, and merchants keep the revenue from selling bags to pay for those bags and to encourage consumers to bring their own reusable bags. But if 65 and 67 both pass, it's less clear. If 67 gets more votes, it's as if 65 didn't pass. The merchants keep the bag revenue. If 65 gets more votes, probably the bag ban is upheld. But the revenues go to the environmental fund. But it could go to court. In fact, it probably would go to court. And the court could say that 65 blocks all of 67 from taking effect. So, okay, who are the people trying to persuade us for and against these two?
Yeah, in general, the people in favor of 65 are against 67. They're the plastic bag manufacturers who would prefer to be supplying the single-use bags. The supporters of 65 include the California Taxpayer Protection Committee and the California Senior Advocates League, with the financial support coming from the plastic bag manufacturers. They say the bag fees will raise up to $300 million a year. Why should the grocery stores keep that money? It's a hidden tax on consumers and profit to the stores. Prop 65 dedicates the bag fees to environmental projects like drought relief, beach cleanup, and litter removal. Californians Against Waste sign the arguments against Prop 65. They say Prop 65's sole purpose is to confuse voters. It was placed on the ballot by 4 out-of-state plastic bag companies to distract from the issue at hand, phasing out plastic bags. So the money for this fund is a drop in the bucket and will shrink over time as customers adjust to bringing reusable bags. Now, supporters of 67 include the Monterey Bay Aquarium, the California Ocean Protection Council, and the California Department of Natural Resources, Recycling and Recovery, with the support coming from Safeway and other grocers. They say yes on 67 will reduce litter, it'll protect the ocean, and it'll reduce cleanup costs. Plastic bags are a deadly threat to wildlife, and 67 continues California's success in phasing out plastic bags. Local bag bans have been very successful, and we need to give the state law a chance to work. The opponents of 67 include California Manufacturers and Technology Association, the California Taxpayer Protection Committee, and the California Senior Advocates League, with support coming from plastic bag manufacturers. They say don't be fooled. Prop 67 is a $300 million tax increase on California consumers, and tax revenue goes to special interests. It could have gone to the environment, but the legislature required grocery stores to keep the new bag tax revenue.
That's it for the statewide measures this time around. What else do voters need to know?
Well, we'd like you to know that the League of Women Voters has speakers like us available before every statewide election. We make presentations on ballot measures throughout the community. If you'd like to schedule a presentation for your group, go to the League of Women Voters of California website at ca.lwv.org and click on Find a Local League. Your local league will be happy to arrange for a speaker for your group.
I'd also like to remind viewers about the unbiased online voter information guide from the League of Women Voters of California Education Fund and MapLight. It's called Voters Edge California, and it can be found at votersedge.org/ca. Type in your address, you get a personalized ballot, candidate and measure information for local, state, and federal contests, campaign finance facts for state candidates and measures, videos on the propositions, news and events, links to your local registrar office, and a voting info section with everything you ever wanted to know about elections. Now it's available in Spanish, too. For busy or new voters who want a quick summary of the propositions and some voting nuts and bolts, check out the Easy Voter Guide, found in libraries and community centers and at easyvoterguide.org. It comes in 5 languages, and all of them are available to download. The Legislative Analyst's Office website at lao.ca.gov offers information on many aspects of California government as well as its finances. The Secretary of State, sos.ca.gov, offers online voter registration along with a lot of election information for current, past, and even propositions that might turn up in future elections. The League of Women Voters of California Education Fund site, cavotes.org, has a host of useful links about registration, voting, ballot measures, and finally, your local registrar of voters site has everything you ever wanted to know about the local measures in voting in your area. But however you decide, please look at your choices. Spend some time understanding them and vote your principles. We're writing laws here, laws that we all end up living under. It's a job worth doing right. Thank you for joining us today and putting some thought into this, and thank you very much to the Better Part for making this program possible.